My name is Dennis Alexander. I co-founded the Faraday Institute way back in 2006, together with my colleague Bob White. And we're quite young, I suppose, by Cambridge standards. We're only 17 years old, which is pretty young by Cambridge standards. I think the university is now, 813 years old, so we have a little ways to go, but you have to start somewhere. So we are 17 years old and still going strong. And as it happens, BioLogos actually started up very soon after we did. It was really started because Francis Collins, who was then the director of the Human Genome Project in the USA, wrote a book published in 2006 called The Language of God. And he got so many thousands of emails in response to that book, which is a real bestseller, by the way, if you haven't read it. And because of that, he began to generate a team of people answering those questions, and that led to a website, and that led to BioLogos. So that's really how that got going. And at the beginning, BioLogos was focusing very much on helping people to understand evolution, especially helping Christian communities in North America to feel happy about evolution and so forth. But over the past few years, they've been spreading their wings and become much more engaged in the wider discussion about science and religion from many different perspectives. Here in Cambridge, the Faraday Institute started out with a much more general aim to engage in science religion from an academic perspective, to create a space where people could come together for academic discussion about that particular topic, and therefore publishing papers, doing research projects, usual kind of thing for this city, and publishing good books and good papers, we hope. But at the same time, trying to disseminate our ideas and research results very broadly and internationally, and really it's been going from strength to strength since that time. In fact, just at lunchtime today, we were having lunch together and just thinking about how the new atheism was very prominent over those years, sort of 2006, 2009, which was very good for us, actually, because it raised the whole interest in the science religion discussion, sometimes a little bit combative and not very helpful ways, but it gave people a lot of interest, I think, in the whole topic. And we were also just thinking about how that has sort of declined now. New atheism is sort of 10 years ago now, and it's really declined. You don't hear much about it these days. But it's left an interesting sort of residue of interest. And I mention that because I've just been co-editing a book with Alistair McGrath from Oxford, and the title is Coming to Faith Through Dawkins, because somewhat to our surprise, we kept, both Alistair and myself, doing different talks around the world, we kept bumping into people who had actually come to faith from atheism and agnosticism, and the trigger for that was reading The God Delusion or reading Richard Dawkins' books and so forth, or Christopher Hitchens. So that book is coming out next year. I just give it a quick plug in passing here while I have the opportunity. It's actually a book of, it's 12 essays written by 12 different authors from 5 different countries, very varied in their backgrounds, and they have some very interesting stories to tell, which I found quite remarkable, actually. So yeah, I think you might want to look out for that book when it comes out. Actually, one of the triggers for which were mentioned in several of those essays were simply their feeling that the new atheists, some of them anyway, were kind of investing evolution with this great ideology as if it's going to give the answer to all of life's questions. And they just thought, I don't think so. And so there are many different ways of knowing, and we need many different approaches in life to really tackle the big questions of life. So that's partly the story in that book. And by the way, just thinking about evolution, I should mention, because this is an international podcast and so forth, that, of course, this is the home of Charles Darwin. He was a student here at Christ College just back in the late 1820s. Christ College, one of Cambridge's 31 colleges. And while here, of course, he was taught by ordained ministers, priests of the Church of England, because all the science he learnt was from Anglican priests, because simply there were no other people allowed to teach in Cambridge at that time, right up until 1871, as a matter of fact. And it's quite interesting to think about that, I think. And the fact that by the mid-1860s, just a few years after the great book Origin of Species, 1859, if you look at the exam papers in natural sciences in the mid-1860s from this university, many of them were saying, discuss Mr. Darwin's theory, fully accepting the validity of Mr. Darwin's theory, and then seeking to apply it into different applications and so on. And of course, all those questions were set by Anglican priests. It's good to remember that, isn't it? That in this city and the Anglican Church more widely, evolution was baptized, if you like, into a Christian worldview at that time. And so the history of the reception of evolution, I think, has been very different in this country compared to the USA. Maybe we'll get onto that in the discussion later on. Just a bit more history, and then I'll hand on to the people and BioLogos telling us what to do next. But this particular building, I don't know if you know anything about the history of this building. I've just been finding out it was actually put up in 1866. And it was, in fact, the Cambridge Conservative Club for many years. So don't walk out, but that is true, okay. And then it was actually gutted by fire in 1926. So you want to look at the fire exit? Anyway, and after that it was reconstructed, and it became the Cosmopolitan Cinema in 1933. And then it became the Art Cinema from 1947. It was actually where the Cambridge Film Festival became established. So arts and science, I'm so delighted that arts and science are coming together where they should be, right in this building this evening especially, and we're happy about that. So, without more ado, again, a very warm welcome over to Colin Hugovoff from BioLogos, who's going to tell us what's going to happen next. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you everyone else for coming out to this live podcast recording of The Language of God. My name is Colin Hugovoff. I'm the producer of the podcast. I've been at BioLogos for 4 years now. And pretty early on, when I started looking for voices to put on the podcast, I realized there were a great many scholars and voices from the UK. So I made a document which has been on my Google Drive now for 3 years called the Great British Podcast Tour. And I pitched to Jim that we come and we interview a whole bunch of people and maybe watch some football and go to some pubs while we're at it. And then, of course, COVID struck and all inklings of travel disappeared. But like everyone else, we figured out that the internet is a pretty good connector. And so we've been able to feature many voices on the podcast. N.T. Wright, Alistair McGrath, Jane Goodall, more recently Simon Conway Morris and Dennis Alexander just a couple weeks ago. But it's great to be here in person, and so glad we've been able to make this trip out. So you heard a little bit about BioLogos. Our mission is to explore God's Word and God's world to inspire authentic faith for today. The Language of God podcast was launched in 2019. It's put out 124 episodes and recently crossed the threshold of having 1 million downloads. I mentioned a few of our guests already. We've also put together a multi-episode series on what it means to be human, and more recently a series about where to find hope in the environmental crisis called Creation Groans. Bethany Solleretter has a piece on that. This fall, we'll be featuring a bunch of interviews from your countrymen and women from our forays over 10 days here between Oxford and Orkney. So stay tuned for that. Jim Stump is the host of The Language of God, and he'll introduce today's guests in just a minute. He's also the vice president of programs at BioLogos. He has a PhD in philosophy and is the author or editor of several books on science and religion. A few things to know about him. He's a Tottenham fan. He's a baker of bread and a vigorous defender of the benefits of rereading good books. You can ask him about that. A few notes about the session. This will be recorded and will be released on the podcast feed in a couple of weeks. You can find a link to the podcast on the pre-printed programs that maybe you have or are outside, or you can just search Language of God on your preferred podcast app. If you could silence any devices, that would be great, but otherwise feel free to make the noises of a lively audience, clap, sigh, gasp if you feel the need. And then after the interview, we'll pause for a minute, and there will be food available, and we'll ask people to go get food and filter back in, and we'll have a short informal question and answer here where you can participate with our speakers here. And then after that, we have the theater and the terrace. People can spread out and have their own conversations following that. So with that, let's enjoy the show.
Welcome to Language of God. I'm your host, Jim Stump. We are thrilled to be here in Cambridge with you. There are 4 of us on staff at BioLogos who made the trip across the pond, and this is week 1 for me of what's going to be a 6-week stay in Europe, as I'm on sabbatical this fall, doing some research and some writing and visiting lots of sights of ancient humans, so stay tuned for where that may go. But tonight, I am thrilled to be here in Cambridge having a conversation with Bethany Soller-Etter and Nick Spencer. Let me introduce them to you briefly. Bethany is a theologian, now located in Edinburgh, has been a longtime friend of BioLogos. She was a speaker at our national conference in Baltimore back in 2019 and has been on the podcast several times discussing her books, which I highly recommend. So this is welcome back to you, Bethany.
Thank you.
And Nick Spencer is a new friend of BioLogos, so welcome to you too, Nick.
Thank you.
Nick is senior fellow at Theos, a think tank in London that conducts research on religion and society. He's the host of the podcast Reading Our Times and co-author of the recent report, Science and Religion, Moving Away from the Shallow End, which is what brings us together this evening. So thank you and welcome to you, Nick. And with that, let's get to the conversation. Something happens now. Well, we'll talk about the report in just a moment, but first we think it's important to get to know you a bit as people. So, Nick, let's start with you. Where did you grow up?
I'm an Essex boy, which might mean something to my fellow countrymen, but probably not to you.
Not that much.
It's class, effectively.
Essex.
Yeah.
All right. So, as a wee lad growing up in Essex, when all of your friends were talking about wanting to become barristers or footballers, and you were saying, when I grow up, I want to be a senior fellow at a think tank?
Yeah, I didn't have many friends, that's right.
How did that happen? Give us a few stops along the way by which you came to where you are now.
I always liked writing. From when I was wee, I liked to write. But I had no religious faith at all. It was a completely non-church family background, not hostile, but just not interested. I went off to university. My parents kind of steeled themselves for me to come back, having had a messy experience with drink or women or drugs, and I came back an Anglican. And they really didn't know how to handle that.
Well, very interesting. And from there, how did you get involved with this think tank, Theos? Do you call it Theos or Theos?
Well, Theos we call it, but those whose Greek is better than mine often call it Theos.
Okay.
Yes. Well, I worked in research, market and social research after I left university, which was an extremely educative experience, but bluntly didn't really get me out of bed at the beginning of the day. And about 5 or 6 years into that, I had the opportunity to use the skills I'd accrued as a qualitative and quantitative researcher, working for a couple of small Christian think tanks. And then 5 years later, I went to go and work for Theos when we started up in 2006. Interestingly, the same time as Faraday did, roughly the same time as you guys did. There was something happening around that time, I guess.
Well, very good. Bethany, we've heard some of your story on previous podcasts, but for the sake of those listening for the first time now, give us at least a couple of highlights of your journey to becoming a theologian who's interested in the sciences.
Yeah, so I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, way up in the north of Canada, where winter is almost never ending. And I came to love Jesus because I loved horses. And so I went to summer camps that tended to be run by evangelical Christians, and they taught me to ride, and they taught me to love Jesus and the Bible, and that's when I started sort of going to church and pursuing that side of things. And I was just one of those people who had questions that need answering. And so I just kept going to school until at some magical point they started paying me to go to school. And I've just flipped to the other side now. So it's been great. I hope to continue on getting to ask interesting questions and trying to seek, maybe not answers, that's a bit ambitious, but at least approaches.
And you've been living here in the UK for
11 years.
11 years now.
Yeah,
Oh,
just
good.
got indefinite leave to remain, so it can happen.
Wow. All right. There are increasing numbers of us back in the North American continent looking for ways to do that, I'm afraid, these days. But that's a topic for a different conversation. Tonight, we are talking science and religion, and BioLogos works primarily in the American context, and we hear quite often that the science and religion conversation is quite different here in the UK. So I was very interested when I saw the reports that came out about moving away from the shallow end. And we heard a bit about Faraday in Dennis Alexander's introduction. Nick, tell us a little bit more about Theos and particularly how you teamed up with Faraday to create this report.
Well, theos effectively exists to tell a better story about Christianity, specifically faith more generally in public life, better, in a sense more accurate, research is at the heart of what we do, but also hopefully in the sense of more cogent, more coherent, more winsome. As Dennis mentioned, we were launched a month after The God Delusion was published, which was some quirk of divine humour, really. And that was an example of the choppy waters into which we were launched. But waters in which the topic of science and religion were, of course, absolutely forefront. And 3 years later, there was the big Darwin anniversary, and we partnered with Faraday on effectively arguing that you can be a theist and a religious believer. And it was great, and it was a very rewarding experience. My interests are kind of slightly broader than science and religion, and I'm a political theologian. But I kept coming back to this question, and I'm very interested in the history of ideas. And about 5, 6 years ago now, I read Peter Harrison's book, The Territories of Science and Religion. And he makes a very good point, that it is nonsensical to say that science and religion have always been opposed to one another when they didn't exist in the formats that we recognise them until really the late 19th century. He begins with an analogy about if you heard about a war between Israel and Egypt in 1600, you'd be slightly dubious about this because neither Israel nor Egypt as national entities existed in 1600. And that's pretty much the same logic of saying there's an argument between science and religion in 1600. Now, Peter's book ends at the end of the 19th century, but it was my conviction that even though in theory these categories are relatively settled in academic life by the end of the 19th century, it doesn't mean that there are enormous confusions and disagreements about what science is and what religion is. So if you're going to hold an opinion on how they get on with one another, it's helpful to know what actually they are. And so this project was effectively an attempt, a very long and very expensive attempt to define two words. What is science? What is religion? And in the light of that, how do they get on with one another?
So give us also a bit of the methodology by which you developed the report, or at least the report was based on the findings. How did you?
So a qualitative element and a quantitative element. The qualitative involved us interviewing just over 100 leading experts who worked in science or religion or philosophy or theology, the majority of whom were non-believers, were, in theory at least, or they emerged not quite this way, to be hostile. We were interested in understanding, in a sense, where people saw the tension. So the majority of the time it's better to interview experts who genuinely see that there is some tension there. On top of that, there was a very large quantitative survey that we commissioned from YouGov, 5,000 UK adults, in which we asked a tranche of questions that were developed on the back of the qualitative element.
Okay. And then give us just briefly sort of the overview of your findings, the executive summary of the report.
It reminds me of that Monty Python sketch when you have to summarise Proust in 15 seconds. Effectively, we have a Pavlovian reaction to science and religion. So that phrase elicits a certain response, and it's one of hostility. So in the UK, roughly speaking, twice as many people see science and religion as incompatible as view them as compatible. If you start probing and burrowing under what they mean by science and what they mean by religion, that hostility begins to fragment and then fall apart. So if you ask people to compare the compatibility of science and a specific religion, like Christianity or Islam, the hostility is less there. If you ask them to compare religion and a specific scientific discipline, like chemistry or neuroscience or cosmology, the hostility almost completely evaporates. It's much more even. So as you can imagine, if you're comparing a specific religion with a specific scientific discipline, there are still perceived tensions there amongst the general population and indeed amongst our expert interviewees. But effectively, the more you, as it were, get into the subject, the more you realise that this initial reaction we have that somehow these two are in conflict and they're at war just begins to fall apart.
That's very interesting. We'll perhaps dig into that a little bit more, but turn to Bethany here, who, in full disclosure, we should say, was one of your 100 expert interviewees.
She was.
So did she cause any particular problems or skew the data in any way
It was
that
a
we should worry
nightmare,
about
I
here?
tell you.
I wasn't hostile. I was problematic. Yeah.
But Bethany, you've had a chance to look at the report. Having lived here in this context for a while, but knowing something of the context back in North America, anything in particular jump out at you or surprise you in this report?
Yeah, there were a couple of things that I found surprising. So one was that the perception of hostility between science and religion was both race-based and gendered. And so it found that 68% of white respondents were on balance thought that science and religion were incompatible versus 48% of those from non-ethnic groups. And it was men were also more likely to voice an opinion that they were hostile to each other than women. And this isn't to say that white men are particularly thick or intransigent or anything like that.
Thank you for clarifying that.
What it tells me is that there's something in the cultural air in Europe and in North America that people, as you said, it's a Pavlovian response. In the water, people just think these two are in conflict. Whereas if you went to, say, India, where 98% of practicing scientists see absolutely no opposition and high compatibility in Elaine Howard Eklund's work, they're not necessarily better informed on the issues. It's just that's the default position. And so I think certainly in the UK, my experience has been, this is anecdotal, is it's less hostile than in parts of the States or Canada. But that still is the basic reaction, is how can those fit together?
You mentioned several times throughout the report some comparisons between the UK and the US in that regard. Do you have any explanations for that beyond just the surface level of, we Americans get hung up about different kinds of things, but why is that? What's the...
I mean, if I'm talking from a North American perspective, I think it really does go back to a very different sense of history. And so, in the States, Darwinism is coming over at the same time as higher criticism, where people are saying, we don't think that parts of the New Testament are historical in the way that they were. And those just kind of got lodged in the North American brain together in a way that they were separated here. So just before we started, Dennis Alexander was talking about how Anglican priests in Cambridge were setting exams asking students to favorably discuss Darwin's theories immediately after the publication of The Origin of Species. So there's a cultural sense here that those are not in as much opposition, whereas I think in the States, you have somebody like Charles Hodge, the principal of Princeton, writing a book saying Darwinism is atheism at around the same time. And so I think you just have different historical roots.
That's absolutely right. I would add something to that. The interesting thing about Darwinism is it has acted as a lightning rod for metaphysical speculation from the earliest days. In fact, from before the earliest days, really from the 18th century, when it was transmutationism. The idea, particularly as it emerges into a culture of natural theology, it's not a scientific theory alone, it has metaphysical implications. In the US, it is invested with social baggage as well, much more so than over here. So I've just written a book on the history of science and religion. I have a chapter on Scopes trial there. But first I went and read the transcripts, and I read Hunter's Civic Biology, the book about which the Scopes trial existed. It would never get published today, absolutely no way, because alongside, interlaced with reasonably sound science, are social judgments about effectively eugenics. And eugenics was an issue over here, but it was a bigger issue in the States, and evolution got wrapped up with social Darwinism and the eugenics movement in a way that invested it with really profound and sometimes very ugly social baggage. And that in various different ways has shaped the dialogue in the US compared to the UK.
Interesting. So in the report then, you note that quite often there are these superficial kinds of questions, perhaps creation and evolution. I say superficial, but the shallow end questions that generate a lot of heat. And through the interviews with the experts like Bethany, you see that out of these conversations emerge the real issues that are behind the conflict. Can you give us some taste, at least, of what the real issues are that cause problems between science and religion?
Yes, happily. And in fact, they don't so much emerge from those conversations, they go before them. That's the critical thing. To the extent that the position you hold on science and evolution vis-a-vis cosmology, for example, or evolution is almost always already decided by your existing position on epistemology or metaphysics or whatever else. I'll give an example of that.
Please.
If you are of the view that there is only one way of attaining reliable knowledge about the world, which is observation, experiment, repetition, so on and so forth, broadly speaking, the scientific method, you will instinctively discount other approaches to knowledge that don't have that, say, possibility of robustness or repetition to them. If you approach, I'll give another example. That's one of the examples of epistemology. Ethics is another one. My thinking here was informed by the work of John Evans, who's a sociologist at San Diego.
Yeah.
One of the points he makes about looking at the science and religion debate in the US is a book called Morals, Not Knowledge. In other words, people approach this issue through an ethical lens rather than through an epistemological lens. And so often, actually, people have their understanding of religion shaped by commentary on the news about religious views of, say, IVF or abortion or anti-vax, whatever. And so they approach their understanding of what religion is through that ethical lens, and that then shapes their idea of how science and religion interact, not least because if the next news report they hear is of scientists achieving X, they implicitly absorb the idea that science does stuff and religion questions whether stuff should be done and usually says no. And that then frames their whole understanding of the debate.
Interesting. So you give 6 areas that these deeper concerns and values even come out of. One of the interesting things I saw in the report is that your report was not just purely descriptive, so I'm quoting you here now, that there are 6 areas of concern in the science and religion debate, and we argue that we need to move away from the shallow end towards the deep end, where the debate is messier but more honest. So that's a prescriptive claim. We ought to do this. And as I've been thinking about this a little bit, it seems to me that the science and religion debate is a very abstract and generalized concept. So I wonder if you might give a little more definition to this. And Bethany, I'd like to get you to weigh in on this as well. Should everyone who talks about science and religion move immediately to the deep end? Or is there some sense in which the shallow end conversations might be entrees for certain people to get in, or people that maybe just aren't that interested in these other conversations? So I'm trying to get at what you in the report are trying to prescribe to the rest of us, and then maybe a little more general thoughts and comments on the breadth of this conversation and all of its nuances and what we should be thinking about that.
There are perils of metaphors, aren't there? And of course, that particular metaphor brings out the image of kind of me moving up to the deep end and hurling non-swimmers
Shoving
in and saying,
everybody
it's
in.
fun in there, why are you complaining? Of course, people will find their own depth to pursue this metaphor even further. The argument is effectively that, look, I don't actually mind, we say this early on, I don't mind if people come to the opinion that science and religion are completely incompatible. If you have that view, fine, but do so on the basis that you are clear what you're talking about when you're talking about religion and what you're talking about science. Are you adopting a methodological approach to science? Are you adopting a functional or substantive approach to religion, so on and so forth? If you're going to voice an opinion on this issue, I think it's an incumbent to have some idea of what you're doing, why you're doing it, and that just slowly moves you towards the deep end.
Yeah, I think one of the frustrating things is it's often people who know one side or the other, but don't know a bit of both that tend to be the loudest voices. And so I think it would be good for people to spend some time studying the disciplines they're not familiar with in terms of entering public debate. But I think that of course, I'm going to be delighted if everybody moves further into the deeper end, if only because I think that's where the pressing questions for our culture now lie. They're not in, did God make the Big Bang? They're in, what do we do about climate change? They're, what do we do about human genetic editing? They're, and these are pressing questions that will literally shape the future of humanity and the planet. And so if we're still busy arguing over some of the debates that are just less relevant to where our culture is, I think that's a lost opportunity.
Good. Okay, so let's have a bit of that deeper conversation, perhaps. So far, we've just been talking about the conversation. I wouldn't even characterize it as a shallow end conversation, but let's dive right into the deep end, and I hope we have our life preservers here with us. One of the 6 issues you identify in the report is anthropology. So what do we think of ourselves, of human beings? I'm particularly drawn to this. It's one of my active areas of research, and this question, what does it mean to be human? I take it that the shallow end conversation there is more on the evolution and creation side, so let's just stipulate for our conversation. God has indeed created human beings, and let's stipulate that evolution is the best scientific description of how we came to be on this planet. So then we're interested in the kinds of questions that arise once we've stipulated this. And I thought it might be fun to start by asking you one of the questions from the survey that you gave to, what did you call it, the UK Gov 5,000
Oh, it's a
people?
YouGov survey, 5,000
YouGov
adults.
survey, so 5,000 people were asked this. And so Bethany, I am now asking you. One of the questions in this category was, are human beings at heart spiritual beings?
Well, I would immediately
Yes or
turn
no?
to Nick
No, yes
and
or
say,
no?
what do you mean by spiritual?
And at heart.
And at heart. Yeah, I think if I can define it, I would say yes, in the sense that I think humans tend to look for meaning in things beyond simply, can I survive? Can I, eat? Can I, we get those things, and sort of kicking back, we say, okay, there's all these deeper layers to life that I'm still not satisfied with. I need to keep looking. I still need something more. And I think I could see that as being spiritual at heart, for looking for something beyond.
Nick, are you allowed to tell us what's behind that question? In my mind, when I heard it, I thought if it was trying to get at the substance dualism issue. Are human beings essentially this immaterial substance, call it a soul, that is the true self, and the rest of this is another substance that's along for the ride for a while? That's not the way Bethany took the question.
I wince whenever I read quantitative questions, not least the ones that I've designed, because they are always inadequate, and you go through many, many iterations. Because you can explore this in greater detail in an interview, you've basically got to keep a quantitative respondent's attention very rapidly. The actual reason for that, and this is a slight segue, that the survey was conducted around the same time as the 2021 UK census, which for the 3rd decade in a row has a religion question on it. And it will show, the data aren't out yet, but it will show that roughly speaking 50% in the UK people, adults, say no religion. That is often confused with being an atheist. And in actual fact, we've got a report coming out on this in a month's time, a remarkable number of people tick the no religion box because that is a social marker and they don't want to associate with any particular religion, and yet at the same time believe certain things about themselves or about the world or about destiny or fate, whatever else, which historically are religious. So that was actually one of the reasons for asking that. But you're right, it does then move into this whole area of what does it mean to be spiritual? And in the qualitative interviews, we were able to unpack that question as, well, does spiritual mean substance dualist? I don't think so at all. But of course, that is how a lot of people will read it. And that was part of the discussion that we could have in the qual.
So given all those qualifications you just gave, Nick Spencer, are human beings at heart spiritual beings?
Yes.
But are you a substance dualist?
No.
Right.
Let me get in and see if we can stimulate some conversation between the three of us here in this topic of anthropology another way, which I like to ask whether you take human beings to differ from other animals in kind or merely differ as a matter of degree? And here, too, we may have to unpack a little bit of what's riding on a question like that. But as a starter, do we differ in kind, or do we only differ in degree from other animal species?
Both. So, I mean, I think that there are certain parts where we differ in kind, in the sense of, I think we are the only species that self-consciously does things like pray and have, attempt a relationship with God. Whether other species do that or not, we don't know. And I would think they probably have some sort of relationship with God, and that God has a relationship with them, but they probably don't pursue that self-consciously. But I think in lots of other ways, we would say there's a difference of degree when we're looking at intelligence, creativity, humor, things that traditionally people have sort of said, this is what makes us special. We're finding more and more in animal studies that actually, no, we're not unique in those ways. And then in a third way, we could say, well, of course we're unique amongst animals, but so are cockroaches. Every creature is unique.
That's what it means to be a species.
That's
right?
what it means to be a species. So, so that would be a very trivial way to answer, but would also be true according to some lines.
What do you think, Nick?
It's a great question, but I would actually agree with Bethany there. I think the difference between degree and kind is overplayed there, particularly if you believe in the emergence of different phenomena. And so so the simple answer is yes, we are different. Self-evidently, I think that's the case. But I think that we are different by, as it were, so many degrees that it becomes a kind.
Yeah, that's the question.
If you can put it, if I can put it that way. Neanderthals played quite a kind of a walk-on role in a lot of the interviews. Very, very interesting. People, did quite a few anthropologists actually, talking about, slightly tongue-in-cheek, would Neanderthals get to heaven? Would Neanderthals have any sense of eternity? And we have some experts talking about, there's no signs of religiosity among Neanderthals, but there's certainly signs of symbolic understanding, possibly signs of some awareness of the existence that the interviewee in question called it after person rather than afterlife. They're not religious as we would recognize it, but then the question is, were we wiped off the face of the earth 60,000 years ago before we had a chance to wipe the Neanderthals off the face of the earth? Might they have attained some conception of religiosity which was comparable to our own? And I'm open to that phenomenon, that idea.
So that leads me to another way of getting at some of the issues here in anthropology, which is some of the terms we use sometimes. So we've been saying humans. What about the relationship between humans and Homo sapiens? I think most of the scientific literature now today extends human back to everything under the Homo genus, right? Were Neanderthals human? Another term we might use is personhood. And when we talk about personhood, that might be divorced from our biology entirely. And we could at least ask whether artificial intelligence might attain personhood, or whether aliens from other planets might attain personhood. And then anytime we're asking questions like this, from the theological perspective, I want to say, so what does it mean to bear the image of God? Did Neanderthals bear the image of God? Could an artificial intelligence bear the image of God? What are the issues under those kinds of questions that you think are important to bubble up from the depths in our deep conversation to the surface of
So many interesting questions there. Obviously, what you're saying is, therefore, what is our definition of the human? If we're going to call certain things human,
what does it mean to be human?
What's it mean to be human? I think it's obviously a difficult question to answer clearly. I think we are really heading along the wrong tracks when we associate humanity with rationality or intelligence.
Yeah.
This is a repeated motif in the AI debate, and I think it's a red herring, really. And often, it's highly intelligent people who are saying that the real critical mark of humanity is high levels of intelligence. That's not a line of argument that should go unquestioned, I've got to be honest with you. And as many people have observed, that creates lots of problems when you have people who are cognitively impaired, for example. I think this is where theology can help. I think, the idea of humanity has got some theological roots to it. And I also think that certainly Christian theology roots humanity in relationality, being as communion to quote an Orthodox theologian, John Zizoulis, and that our personhood resides in our capacity for normative capacity for relationship. And we can unpack what that actually means. But to my mind, that doesn't close down the possibility of personhood for Neanderthals, AI, aliens. I'm not saying it necessarily totally opens the door, but I certainly wouldn't want to prematurely close it down, because if we came across other species, perhaps, or other alien life forms that exhibited the kind of relational qualities that I at least would associate with personhood, I'd be open to them.
Yeah. I think that a lot of these questions, one of the questions lying behind it is the ethics question. What do we need this demarcation for? So if we're asking what is a person versus what is an animal, a relevant question might be, can we kill it and eat it? Or can we, how do we treat it under the law, right? So throughout human history, many humans were not considered proper humans under the law, and even now that debate continues to rage in questions like abortion. Is this a person? Is this not a person? There's no question about it being Homo sapien, but is it a person? And then we could get into legal definitions of person as in corporations. So I think often one of the ways to try and unpack that is ask, what is the question behind for which we need the demarcation?
So let's keep that going a little bit, because I suspect many of these questions are not just, purely speculative, that in the coming decades, we are going to have to decide more specifically if an artificial intelligence has consciousness and therefore personhood and therefore rights.
Yeah.
How are we going to make that decision?
That's really tricky. So I don't know if you saw this story. There was a Google engineer recently who was let go for claiming that their AI was self-conscious, and he sort of released against all the rules a set of conversations he had with this AI. And some of it is really quite interesting. You read this and you think, oh, wow. That's a good answer that the computer came up with about what it means to be a self and about being lonely and, all these different things about fears and joys. And, and so you're thinking, ever since computers passed the Turing test, the average person cannot tell if they're talking to a computer or to another person. Our methodologies are struggling to keep up with the technology.
That was a fascinating instance. Blake Lemoine, who then wrote a piece explaining why he thought that LaMDA was sentient. I've read the transcript, and I've got to be honest, I'm not persuaded at all. It doesn't strike me as a very convincing example of sentience and intelligence. But Lemoine calls himself a Christian priest. I've never quite got to the bottom of which denomination. I think it's probably on the heterodox end of the spectrum, shall we say. But his argument is that how did I come to this conclusion that LaMDA was sentient? Well, I respect science. I'm a scientist by training, but I believe there are other ways of knowing. Let's go back to our epistemological question. And how did I know, how did I seek to know that LaMDA was sentient? I spoke to it. And I think this is a fascinating epistemological difference. Some things you get to know by withholding yourself. That's the premise of the experiment. You don't bring your own subjective views into the experiment. You take yourself away from it and try and judge it objectively. But when you get to know persons, or when you seek to get to know persons, there's an element of self-gift there, of subjectivity, of introducing myself into the encounter. Now, I think that is possibly not the entire, but a path towards answering your question, how would we know? I think it's partly not experimenting on these things, but engaging with them.
Is there any way of applying this to then the question about, say, Neanderthals, of whether they had this elusive property of personhood, or whether they were image bearers of the divine as well? Is there any way of answering that aside from speculation?
I mean, here's maybe where I get into trouble and cause problems. I don't think personhood is an objective category. I think it's a social construct that we make. And I think something like being made in the image of God is I could say sort of a social construct or a calling that God makes. So I don't think that, if there are any definitive lines, I don't think we would ever know them. But it would be up to God's will. So, I follow someone like Joshua Moritz, who sees being made in the image of God similar to the election of Israel. Mm-hmm. What happens over and over again in the Hebrew Bible is that God says, okay, I chose you from among the nations, but not because you're special, not because you're big, not because you're powerful, but because I chose it. And so I think if humans are chosen amongst the animals to bear God's image in a particular way, it's much more along those lines than sort of we could say, oh, Neanderthals, they had this level of intelligence and therefore, or they had this level of spiritual longing. Because again, that's an argument made of chimpanzees who dance in thunderstorms and in waterfalls and
so I'm very attracted to that view that it's a calling more than a set of objective categories, as you were saying earlier, Nick. I wonder though if there are some capacities that are necessary as a species in order to do this, or could God have called cucumbers to be God's image bearers to us on earth, and we would have been walking around and maybe not eating them then, but I don't know. Is there some, do we need to have language? Do we need to have moral responsibility? Do we have to have the capacity to be moral? And I know there's a very difficult question with regard to specific individuals of our species, which makes me wonder even more if that calling is a calling to us as a whole rather than to each person individually, and that all of us are needed to bear that image in that way.
So in Bethany Solleretter's theological system,
let's hear it.
So I'm not representing anybody else's view but my own. That capacity is for some of the members of the species to be able to develop the capacity to love. Yeah, and so I don't think love is something we find in nature. I think you see altruism, affection, attachment, various things like that. Whereas I think love is a particular fermentation of the human soul and its desires and natural capacities mixed with the work of God. So I sort of say, love is like beer. It doesn't appear in nature, but it can be created through these forms of sort of human culture.
And makes nature a better place.
And it makes nature a better place. And so I think that's how I see love. It's not a natural intrinsic thing, but it's something God works out in humans, with humans, to make something that is supernatural, and that is what makes us.
Supernatural, but I wonder if we might also at least see hints and precursors of it in other species.
Sure.
That there is a natural history to how we develop that capacity. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, beer needs ingredients, and so I think love uses evolutionary desires as the basic ingredients. So I think, I don't think sort of love is altruism plus. Love is a crazy mixture of our likes and dislikes, of our altruism and our hate, and all those desires being transfigured into something else. So I do think it's deeply attached to those natural capacities and desires, but it itself is something else.
Nick, any final thoughts on this?
Actually, I think that's exactly right. You have the extremes.
I was hoping to get you arguing.
I know this is worrying, isn't
terrible.
it? But I think it's right, and the pure capabilities approach is surely wrong, because that says, well, personhood is what we can do, and therefore we're presenting ourselves as inevitably therefore going to be persons according to what we're capable of doing. But the other extreme, I think the calling is right, but the other extreme, as you rightly say, well, could God call anything, and could God call the stones? Possibly, but it seems to me that there is a match there, that if effectively we're going to commission a gardener species, which is where we are, who we are, you need to be clear that they can be capable of gardening. And just an aside, going back to your initial question with the Neanderthals, I think there is much more. I think it's a watch this space. One of the comments I got from the interviewees is it's fascinating how, when we first identified Neanderthals, they were alien, they were other, they were knuckle-dragging monsters the more we realised that they were similar to us, and in fact that we probably share around 2% of our DNA with them, all of a sudden we've baptised them with our glorious humanity. And actually they're much more intelligent and more sophisticated. I think that is a journey we're going to go on, and I suspect we will find more and more convincing examples of their sophistication in the archaeological record.
Well, I have to say I'm rather enjoying this conversation, and it feels like we're just getting started in the deep end here, plumbing some of the depths, but we are about out of time for this portion of the event. Perhaps we could close with each of you giving a concluding statement of some sort, perhaps some advice for next steps people might take in having these kinds of conversations, or even just what your next step is in contributing to a deeper science and religion conversation, what you're working on.
Well, I guess I would say, we were talking just before the show about the illustrations in the report and how beautiful they were. And they're stills from an animation film that my colleague Emily Down is putting together, which is going to be sort of released in a month or so's time, primarily for an educational audience. The script of the film is just chock full of questions. They're great questions. Again, I'm not particularly concerned at the end of the day where people come out on them, but they're the kind of questions that are worth debating about. They're the kind of questions that are indicative of our humanity. And and they're science and religion questions, I should say, rather obviously. And it's a tragedy that for so much of the last 20 years or so, lots of the public rhetoric has been around science and religion effectively competing explanations for the way they were, and this is a battle. And it just, apart from the fact it's not a very convincing argument, it just drains from some fascinating conversations the life. And so my suggestion would be actually watch Emily's movie and then go to the pub, have some beer, and discuss them.
Good. Bethany?
I don't have any good advice, so I think I'm going to stick to what I'm working on next, which is basically, what do we do if we cannot stop climate change? Because I think we're increasingly heading down that road that's becoming an inevitability. I can say this word, and we I think are still in denial about how serious the consequences will be, and that they could be better if we started acting now, and not simply with the idea that we can reverse the changes or control the planet, but think about how can we roll with these changes. So I'm trying to think about that.
Do you have any preliminary thoughts you can share with us on what we should do if we can't stop?
Welcome migrants. We're going to see a whole lot more migrants than we're seeing now. And I think that countries' attitudes towards welcoming or refusing to welcome them will shape geopolitical history in the next few decades. I think we'll look back on Syria and Ukraine as the good old days. And I think we need to be ready for that. And I think the other thing would be to try and really get a sense of letting go of thinking we can control everything. So I think there are interesting parallels between we try and control climate, we also try and control end-of-life issues. So we want to extend. The moment we can't extend, we want to then have control over how it ends. And I think that there's a similar sort of thing going on with climate change, where instead of sort of saying we're part of nature, we'll move with it, of course we affect it in good ways and bad, but also reminding ourselves that we're creatures, not the creators, and that a lack of control will always be part of our lives.
Well, wouldn't it be great if Christians had a leading voice in how this conversation goes over the next couple of decades? It's a very important topic, and one that we should talk about again sometime, but we are at the end of this time. So I ask the audience if you'd join me in thanking Bethany and Nick for this engaging conversation.
Thank you, everyone in the live audience, for being here today. Thank you to Bethany and Nick. Language of God is produced by BioLogos. It's been funded in part by the Fetzer Institute, the John Templeton Foundation, and by individual donors who contribute to BioLogos. Language of God is produced and mixed by Colin Hugworth. That's me. Our theme song is by Breakmaster Cylinder. BioLogos is located in the United States, in Grand Rapids, Michigan. You can join in online conversations on the BioLogos forum or visit our website, biologos.org, to find articles, videos, and other resources on faith and science. Thanks for listening.